Look at that one peck another hood rat out here at midnight thinking she owns the road. Let's go remind her how things work." Deputy Colt Bridges said it quietly, almost lazily, the way a man says something he has said 100 times before, his eyes fixed through the windshield on the figure standing alone at the pump. A black woman in a gray hoodie, yoga pants hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Not doing a single thing wrong in the world except existing in a place he had already decided she didn't belong. Deputy Ryan Peck said nothing back. He was 27 years old and still in that stage of his career where he confused silence with professionalism. The gas station sat at the edge of Route 9 like something the highway had forgotten, a crumbling Texaco with flickering overhead fluorescents that cast everything beneath them in a sickly, jaundiced, yellow, cracked concrete that had given up pretending to be maintained a single-pump island, and the particular kind of silence that only exists at the far end of a long night when the rest of the world has gone to bed and left you alone with your choices. There were no other customers, no other cars, nothing moving except the woman at the pump and the slow, rhythmic clicking of the gas counter ticking upward. Her name was Naomi Caldwell. She was 58 years old, and she had spent the last 3 days in the state capitol sitting through an exhausting judicial conference panel after panel on sentencing reform constitutional thresholds, the evolving standards of proportional justice, the kind of work that feeds something important in you while simultaneously draining everything else. And all she had been thinking about for the last 90 miles of dark highway was the particular comfort of her own bed, her own pillow, the smell of the house she shared with her husband Garrett, who would have left the kitchen light on because he always did when she drove home late. She was not dressed like the person she was. She had traded her tailored suits and judicial pearls for an oversized gray university hoodie, worn-out black yoga pants, and a pair of scuffed running shoes that had logged more miles than she could count. Her hair, which she usually wore in a neat and authoritative bun, was pulled back in whatever configuration had survived 3 days of hotel pillows. To anyone passing by, to anyone operating purely on the surface of things, she looked like just another tired woman on her way home from somewhere unremarkable. The cruiser didn't pull up to a pump. That was the first thing she noticed because she noticed everything. It was a professional habit, so deeply embedded, she couldn't turn it off even when she was exhausted. The white and green Oak Haven County Sheriff's Cruiser rolled into the lot, slowly circled her sedan the way something circles before it commits, and then jerked to a hard stop at a deliberate angle that blocked her car completely. Deputy Colt Bridges stepped out of the driver's side. He was broad-shouldered, late 30s, a tight buzz cut above a face that had learned early how to arrange itself into authority, and he walked with the particular swagger of a man who has spent 14 years being told that his instincts are the same thing as the law. His right hand rested near his belt, not gripping anything, just resting a casual reminder of what was there. Deputy Ryan Peck followed half a step behind. Younger, less certain, his eyes moving across the empty lot in the way of someone who is already reading the atmosphere and finding it slightly wrong but not yet sure what to do about that feeling, Evening Bridges said. And the word was a performance, the particular brand of mocking politeness that isn't courtesy at all, but its opposite. The kind of greeting designed to establish the terms of an encounter before the other person has had a chance to say a single word about what those terms should be. "Good evening, officers," Naomi replied, and her voice was steady, unhurried. The voice of a woman who has spent decades requiring order from rooms that didn't want to give it. She didn't flinch when he approached. She didn't shift her weight or pull her hoodie tighter or do any of the small physical things that people do when they feel the pressure of an unearned authority bearing down on them. She simply watched him come the way a person watches weather, not afraid of it, just reading it, cataloging it, understanding exactly what kind of storm it is going to be. "Bit late to be out driving around this part of town, isn't it?" Bridges said, stepping closer, his eyes moving deliberately over her clothes, her hair, the worn shoes, his upper lip curling just slightly at the corner. The micro-expression of a man who has already decided and is now only looking for confirmation. "Just passing through," Naomi said, turning her attention back to the pump. "Heading home. Home, where he pressed, and the step he took forward as he asked it was not incidental. It was territorial, a physical claim on a space that was hers. "I live in the city," she said, her voice remaining level. "I just need gas." The pretense fell away after that, the way pretense always does when it has served its purpose. Bridges told her there had been reports of break-ins in the residential area a few miles back, that she matched a description, and that he needed to see some ID. The lot was silent. Her scanner app running in her phone's background for the entire drive had registered nothing. No dispatch calls, no burglary reports, no activity of any kind on the Oak Haven frequency for the last 2 hours. She knew this. She also knew that she was standing at a pump, not driving, and that the legal framework for what he was demanding from her simply did not exist in the way he was presenting it. She turned to face him fully and told him simply and clearly that she had done nothing wrong, and that she wasn't going to be providing identification for something she hadn't done in a place she had every legal right to be at an hour that was not his to police. She did not cite statutes. She did not quote amendments. She was not a law professor correcting a student. She was a woman standing in a parking lot at midnight, declining to be treated like a suspect for the crime of needing gasoline. The words were quiet, firm, and entirely without apology. Bridges's face changed in a way that told Naomi everything she had already suspected about him. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something older and uglier than anger. A deep reflexive fury at being refused by someone he had already categorized as someone who had no right to refuse him. The color rose in his neck, and he closed the remaining distance between them until he was near enough that she could smell stale coffee and something meaner underneath it, and his voice dropped to the register that men like him use when they want women to understand that the conversation has changed. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "You're going to give me that ID, and my partner is going to take a look at your vehicle, or you are going to have a very bad night." "You don't have my consent to search my vehicle," Naomi said, and her voice had dropped too, but not out of fear, out of precision, the way a person drops their voice when they want every word to land cleanly. "And if you continue to detain me without cause, you are the one creating a legal problem." "Not me," Bridges snapped. There was no other word for it. The composure he had been maintaining as a thin surface performance simply fractured, and he lunged forward and grabbed her right wrist with a force that was not about restraint, but about punishment, wrenching her arm behind her back in a single violent motion while he began repeating "stop resisting" in a loud manufactured panic, performing for the dashboard camera on his cruiser across the lot, producing the audio record of a compliance he was inventing in real time. Naomi did not struggle. She made her body completely still, completely cooperative, and she spoke clearly and deliberately into his lapel microphone as he held her. She was not resisting. She was complying fully. She was being subjected to an unlawful arrest without probable cause. She was noting the badge number visible on his chest. The words were calm, sequential, and precisely chosen because she understood in that moment that the microphone on his shirt was the most important witness in the parking lot, and she was going to give it everything it needed. He slammed her face into the trunk of her own car. The cold metal hit her cheek with a shock that went through her skull. And in the half-second of clarity that followed the impact, she heard Peck somewhere behind her saying, "Vance, you sure about this?" in the voice of a man who already knows the answer is no, but lacks the spine to act on it. And she heard Bridges bark back at him to put the cuffs on her, and then she felt the steel close around her wrists tighter than they needed to be, tighter than policy permitted the bite of them immediate and mean. In the seconds that followed as they dragged her toward the cruiser, Naomi made the decision that would shape everything that came after it. She could say 4 words, "I am a judge," and this would be over inside 60 seconds. Bridges would backtrack. Peck would look at the ground. Someone would find a very convenient explanation. And the next night and the night after that, they would go back out onto Route 9 and do exactly this to the next woman who came through alone, tired and without a title that made her matter to them. The bruises on her wrists would fade and nothing else would change at all. She decided that was not acceptable. They needed to hang themselves with their own rope, and she was prepared to give them all the slack they required. The back seat of a patrol cruiser is designed without the comfort of the person sitting in it in mind, hard-molded plastic that offers no support, no give, nothing that acknowledges the human body as something that might need accommodation. And with her arms pinned behind her back, the position was not just uncomfortable, but specifically deliberately unpleasant in the way that institutional spaces are often unpleasant, as though the discomfort itself is part of the message being delivered. Her wrists throbbed. She focused on her breathing the way she had learned to in the years before she took the bench in the harder years when she was a public defender and the weight of other people's helplessness sat on her chest every day. In the front seat, Bridges and Peck had settled into the particular giddiness of men who have successfully exerted force and are now processing the adrenaline of it like a shared drug. Bridges adjusted the rearview mirror until he could see her face, a deliberate choice performed for her benefit, and he smiled the smile of a man performing his own power for an audience he assumed could not do anything about it. "You learn those big words watching Law and Order, sweetheart," he said loud enough to make sure she heard it. "Let's see how smart you feel sitting in a concrete box until morning." Peck made a sound that was approximating a laugh, though it had an anxious edge to it that he probably couldn't have explained even to himself. Naomi looked out the barred window at the passing streetlights. She was not seething. Seething would have been a waste of the only resource she had available to her right now, which was clarity, and she needed all of it. She was composing, mentally building the sequence of what came next, the precise procedural architecture of accountability. Each step in its logical order. The internal affairs, filing the federal civil rights complaint, the chain of documentation she would need to make this impossible to minimize or bury. She was also thinking about Ray Vasquez, whose name was at the top of her docket. For the next morning, a young man facing years in state prison on a drug possession charge, fighting a motion to suppress evidence based on the excessive force used during his arrest. A case file she had read 3 days ago in the state capitol that now carried a completely different gravity as though she were reading it for the first time with different eyes. She passed a billboard she recognized. She had driven this stretch of road hundreds of times coming home from court, but she was seeing it now from the wrong side of a cage. And the familiarity of the landmark from this unfamiliar angle produced something in her chest that was more instructive than any brief or opinion she had ever read. The precinct was busy, in the way late-night precincts always are, a weary, fluorescent-lit busyness that never quite stops, and they brought her in through a side entrance rather than the front, which she noted and filed. Sergeant Walt Fenner was at the booking desk, a tired-looking man at the end of a long shift who had developed the efficient detachment of someone who has processed so many people that each individual one has become a category rather than a person. He looked up when they came in, took in the woman in the gray hoodie being walked in by his colleagues, and reached for a booking slip. Bridges rattled off the charges with the casual pride of someone filing a successful report. Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, refusal to identify possible suspect in a string of residential burglaries. Fenner wrote it down without audible reaction. He asked her name, and she told him clearly, Naomi Caldwell. He typed it into the system, asked for her address, and when she gave it, a gated enclave in the neighboring district, the kind of address that carried a certain weight. If you were paying attention. Something moved briefly across his face before the tiredness took it back, and he stamped the paperwork and told them to take her belongings and put her in holding cell 3. Let the morning shift sort out the burglary angle. They took her phone, her keys, her wallet. Bridges picked up the wallet and dropped it directly into a manila evidence envelope without opening it, a gesture so careless, so completely uninterested in the person it belonged to, that it would have seemed almost comical under different circumstances. Inside the wallet, tucked behind her credit cards, was her Judicial Commission card and her State Bar Association badge, the 2 items that would have ended the entire evening in an instant. He sealed the envelope and tossed it into the intake bin. The hallway to the holding cells was long and smelled of industrial bleach applied over things that bleach couldn't fully reach, and holding cell 3 was at the end of it, a small cold room with a poured concrete floor, a metal bench bolted to one wall, a single exposed bulb overhead, and a drain in the center of the floor that Naomi looked at for a long time after the iron door swung shut behind her, and the lock engaged with a sound that was definitive in the way that very few sounds in life actually are. She had sentenced people to rooms like this one. She had reviewed transcripts describing conditions like this: the cold, the concrete, the particular quality of silence that is not peaceful but pressurized. And she had been fair and measured in every assessment, careful to weigh the evidence, careful not to let sentiment override legal reasoning. She had always believed she understood what she was weighing. Sitting on the metal bench with the cold coming up through the floor the way it always does in these rooms, not all at once, but slowly, methodically, finding the thin places in your resolve and settling into them. She understood that she had not understood it at all. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. She did not sleep. She sat in the stillness, which was something her years on the bench had taught her to do, to inhabit silence without filling it, to let it tell you things that noise would drown out. She rubbed her wrists, carefully examining the welts with the practiced detachment of someone cataloging evidence, which is exactly what she was doing, because her wrists were evidence, and she was going to need them to be legible in the morning. The bruising was already deepening. She could see the purple spreading beneath the skin like a slow tide coming in, and she pressed gently along the edges of the marks and noted the tenderness with the same methodical care she brought to reviewing an exhibit. She thought about Ray Vasquez. She had read his case file in the Capitol, a young man no prior record worth speaking of pulled over on a Tuesday evening for a broken taillight, the traffic stop escalating within minutes into something the arresting officers described in their report as a standard force escalation in response to a non-compliant suspect, and what the dashcam footage told a somewhat different story about. She thought about him sitting where she was sitting right now in a room exactly like this one on a night, probably very much like this one, and she thought about the particular way the body learns helplessness, the dropped shoulders, the careful avoidance of eye contact, the posture of a person who has been taught by the world to make themselves smaller. And she felt something settle into her bones that she had only previously understood in her mind, a kind of knowing that could not be acquired from a brief or a transcript or the most well-argued motion ever filed in her court. She made a decision in the cold. She would not trade on her title until the moment her title produced the maximum possible amount of accountability. Not for herself, because her wrists would heal and her reputation was intact, and she had resources and a husband who was already making phone calls. But for the next person in this cell, the person who didn't have any of that, the person who needed the system to be made better before they arrived in it. Not after. She marked time by sound, the change of voices beyond the cell door. The different footsteps, the shift in the quality of the building's ambient noise that told her the overnight crew had handed off to the morning. Somewhere beyond the metal door, a different set of hands was processing the evidence envelope that held her wallet. The footsteps that approached cell 3 were hesitant in a way that the night shifts hadn't been, and when Officer Maya Okafor appeared on the other side of the bar's clipboard in hand, her face already communicating something before she had located the words for it. Naomi watched the recognition arrive, the way she had watched hundreds of things arrive across the bench, not slowly, not gradually, but in a single moment of complete and irreversible understanding that rearranged everything that had existed before it. Maya looked at her notes. She looked up at the woman on the bench. She looked back at her notes. Then her hands began to shake. She fumbled with the key ring so badly that the keys hit the concrete floor with a sound that seemed enormous in the silence, and she bent to retrieve them with the particular mortification of someone who has just understood the full weight of what she is standing in the middle of. When the door finally swung open, Naomi rose from the bench with the deliberate, unhurried movements of a woman who has spent the night deciding exactly how the next several hours are going to go. She smoothed the wrinkles from her hoodie. She did not rush. She waited until Maya, her voice barely holding together, delivered the information her husband was here bail had been posted. There had been a massive misunderstanding. The watch commander was on his way. And then Naomi looked at the young officer with an expression that was not unkind but was absolutely final, and she said 2 words. "My belongings." She did not look back at the cell as she walked down the hall. Some things you only need to see once. The booking area that had been the unremarkable machinery of a routine overnight shift 8 hours earlier had transformed into something that resembled the moments before a very serious weather event. The particular stillness of people who know something is coming and have run out of options for not being in its path. Sergeant Fenner stood at attention behind his desk with the posture of a man who has recently aged several years. Captain Doug Harlan came out of his office still buttoning his collar, which told Naomi exactly how much warning he'd had. The night sergeant, who had stamped her paperwork, was nowhere in the building. Bridges and Peck were also absent. Their shift had ended. They had gone home to sleep, and they were at this moment entirely unaware that the world they would wake up into was not the same one they had left. Garrett Caldwell was pacing the lobby in the controlled, deliberate way of a man containing a very large amount of fury through professional habit. And when he saw Naomi come through the door, disheveled, bruised at the wrists, wearing her gray hoodie, like armor, he crossed the room and wrapped his coat around her shoulders without saying anything, which was the right thing to do and which was why she had married him. When he did speak, it was quiet and precise. He could have the chief of police in his office by noon. He could have those deputies suspended before sundown. He had already texted 2 partners at the firm. Captain Harlan stepped forward with his hands raised and his mouth already forming the language of institutional damage control. "If we had known, if you had only said," and Naomi stopped him with 1 sentence. She told him to make sure Deputies Bridges and Peck were not late for their evidentiary hearing this morning, because she ran a punctual courtroom and she despised tardiness. Harlan went the color of old paper. He had just realized which case was at the top of her docket. The master bathroom of their home was quiet in the early morning, the light coming in pale and flat through the frosted window above the sink, and Naomi stood at the mirror and pushed back the sleeves of her hoodie and looked at her wrists in the clean, honest light of her own home. The bruising had fully come in overnight, dark purple, mottled with deep red, wrapping both wrists completely the kind of marks that a medical examiner would photograph and a jury would remember. She turned her wrists, slowly examining them the way she examined evidence, and she felt something that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, but was something in between the two, something she recognized as the specific emotion of a person who has just learned something true and painful and important that they cannot unknow. Garrett appeared in the doorway in his suit tie, not yet nodded, his eyes moving from her face to her wrists and back again with the expression of a man whose instinct to protect is colliding with his knowledge of who his wife is. He told her that Judge Nora Harrison could take the docket. She was already covering the afternoon session anyway. He told her she had been assaulted, that she had every right to take the day, that nobody expected her to walk back in there this morning. She reached past him to the velvet hanger on the back of the door and lifted down her judicial robe, the heavy black fabric, the particular weight of it across the shoulders, the way it settled around her like something that had been waiting. She told Garrett without looking away from the mirror that if she stayed home, Bridges and Peck would walk into her courtroom that morning feeling like kings, believing that the badges on their chests were licenses for whatever they decided they needed to do, and they would walk out the same way. And tonight they would be back on Route 9, and the next woman who pulled off the highway for gas would have no idea what was about to happen to her. She pushed her arms through the wide sleeves of the robe and watched in the mirror as the dark fabric fell to her wrists, covering the bruises, completely concealing every mark they had put on her until she was ready to show them. She looked at herself once, steady, composed, unreadable, and then she picked up her bag and walked downstairs, because she had a courtroom to open and there was not a minute to waste. The marble corridors of the Oak Haven County District Courthouse moved with the particular organized chaos of a Tuesday morning in session lawyers in sharp suits conducting whispered strategy sessions with their clients on the wooden benches. Families clustered together in the quiet solidarity of people waiting for something that will change their lives. Bailiffs cutting through the foot traffic with the efficient authority of people who know exactly where they are going and cannot be stopped. The smell was the same. It always was. Old wood anxiety. The faint industrial note of the cleaning solution that got mopped into the floors every night and never quite dried. Bridges and Peck came through the metal detectors like men arriving at a party they had thrown. They bypassed the civilian line by flashing their badges at the court officers, a habit so deeply embedded it had become automatic. Exchanged fist bumps with a couple of officers they recognized from previous hearings moved through the corridor with their chins up and their shoulders back. Peck looked slightly pale, the graveyard shift having cut into his sleep, but Bridges was fully inflated with the previous night's satisfaction, and he had sent Peck a text that morning, "Hope our gas station lawyer is enjoying her concrete breakfast. See you at the courthouse," that had made him feel clever in a way he hadn't paused to interrogate. Outside courtroom 302, their union representative Lance Hobbs met them with copies of their sworn affidavits and the practiced efficiency of a man who has shepherded officers through suppression hearings many times before. The briefing was quick and confident. Judge Caldwell is a stickler for procedure, but she runs a professional courtroom. She respects law enforcement, stick to the script. Feared for your safety. Suspect was non-compliant. Standard escalation of force. The defense motion is weak, and the judge will see that. Bridges checked his reflection in the glass panel of the courtroom door, straightened his uniform collar, and said, "Easy money." Inside 302. They took the front row behind the prosecution table, crossed their arms, and settled in with the comfort of men who expect the morning to confirm what they already believe about themselves. Around them, the gallery filled gradually reporters who had been assigned to cover what was supposed to be a routine suppression, hearing a few law students doing courtroom observation hours, the families of other defendants scheduled for later in the docket. Nobody was paying particular attention to the two deputies in the front row. Then Captain Doug Harlan came through the back doors of the gallery at something close to a run. He was red-faced, his uniform jacket not fully closed, his eyes scanning the room with the desperate urgency of a man who needs to stop something that may already be beyond stopping. He spotted Bridges and Peck and began pushing his way through the wooden pews toward them, and he was by approximately 45 seconds too late. "All rise." Arthur's voice, the veteran bailiff who had called courtroom 302 to order for 19 years, filled the room with the kind of authority that doesn't need volume, just certainty, and every person present rose in the same automatic motion that comes from a lifetime of being in rooms where the instruction carries the weight of the law itself. Harlan froze in the center aisle, his hand half reaching for the back of a pew, and the expression that moved across his face in that moment was the expression of a man watching a vehicle he is driving approach something he cannot stop. The heavy wooden door behind the elevated bench swung open. Naomi Caldwell came through it the way she always did, without hurry, without performance. The black robe moving around her with the unhurried gravity of something that knew it didn't need to announce itself. And she ascended the steps to the bench with the particular quality of motion that belongs to people who have inhabited authority long enough that it has become indistinguishable from who they are. She stood at the center of the elevated mahogany desk and looked out over her courtroom. Her expression a mask of absolute judicial neutrality that gave nothing away and asked for nothing in return. "Be seated," she said, and the room obeyed. In the front row, Deputy Colt Bridges sat back with the easy confidence of a man settling in for a morning he expects to find comfortable, and he glanced up at the bench. The way you glance at something you don't expect to surprise you. Routine automatic. The preliminary size-up of a judge you've appeared before a dozen times. And then something happened behind his eyes that was not routine at all. He looked at her. His brain sent a signal his body didn't know how to process. He looked again, more slowly this time, moving from her face to the set of her jaw, to the particular quality of her stillness, and then down to her hands resting on the bench, and then back up to her face. Next to him, Deputy Ryan Peck produced a sound that was involuntary and small, and that he would spend a very long time wishing he had not made in a room full of reporters. Both men's hands found the wooden railing in front of them at almost exactly the same moment, and their knuckles went white in tandem like something synchronized. "Good morning, counsel." Naomi opened the thick manila folder on her desk and arranged her pens with the methodical care of someone who intends to be here for a while. "We will begin this morning's docket with the evidentiary hearing on the motion to suppress in the matter of State versus Vasquez. The court understands we are examining the conduct of the arresting officers and the constitutional basis of the stop and subsequent detention." She let that settle. Then she lifted her gaze from the folder and she looked at Deputy Colt Bridges with the kind of attention that has no warmth in it whatsoever, the cold, precise attention of an instrument that has been waiting all night to be used. "I see the arresting officers are present. Deputy Bridges, Deputy Peck. Please be aware the court appreciates your punctuality." She said it without irony and without softness. "Deputy Bridges, please take the witness stand." The walk from the gallery to the witness box was not long, perhaps 30 feet, but it appeared to cost Bridges something significant, as though each step was being extracted from him individually by a force he couldn't resist and couldn't name. He placed his hand on the Bible when Arthur offered it, and the palm left a damp print on the leather cover that Arthur noted without comment. His voice when he confirmed that he would tell the truth was not the voice he had used the previous night in the Texaco lot. It was smaller, thinner. The voice of a man who is beginning to understand the shape of the room he is standing in. Defense attorney Nolan Price rose with the measured confidence of someone who has just watched the ground shift beneath the opposing counsel's feet and is making careful decisions about where to put his own weight. He opened simply and directly, "Deputy Bridges, your sworn affidavit states that you initiated physical contact with the defendant because he was non-compliant and you suspected criminal activity. Could you please describe for the court the specific articulable facts that led to that suspicion?" Bridges gave the script. High crime area. Refusal to provide identification. He delivered it with the flat competence of a man reciting something he memorized, and he looked once toward Lance Hobbs in the gallery, who gave him a small, encouraging nod that he would later wish he had not given. Naomi let the answer sit in the air for just long enough. Then she set down her pen and leaned forward, not dramatically, but with the specific forward movement of someone who has decided that the distance between herself and the subject needs to close. "Deputy Bridges," she said, and her voice had the quality of a very sharp instrument being used at its designed purpose. "I am a great believer in the use of hypothetical scenarios to establish an officer's understanding of the law. I'd like to walk through one with you, if you don't object." She did not pause for his response. Suppose a citizen is standing alone at a gas station late at night. She is wearing a hooded sweatshirt. She is pumping gas. She is not engaged in any observable illegal activity. She has not made any furtive movements, has not fled, has not done anything that a reasonable officer could point to as the basis for suspicion. Under your reading of the law, does her mere presence at that location at that hour constitute sufficient grounds for an investigatory detention? Bridges swallowed. "No, Your Honor. Not just being there." "Excellent. We agree on the foundations." Naomi's tone was surgical in its politeness, the politeness of a scalpel. "Now let's advance the scenario. The officers approach this woman and demand her identification, citing unverified, unsubstantiated reports of burglaries in the general area. The woman, knowing her rights as a citizen, calmly and politely declines to provide identification because she has not been told she is suspected of any specific crime. In your professional judgment, Deputy Bridges, does that lawful refusal constitute disorderly conduct? Does invoking a constitutional right become resisting arrest?" In the gallery, Lance Hobbs had stopped reviewing his notes. He looked up slowly, and as the pieces assembled themselves into a shape he could recognize, his face went through a sequence of expressions that ended somewhere in the vicinity of genuine alarm. He stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. This hypothetical has no relevance to the facts of the current." Naomi's head turned toward him with the smooth, complete precision of something mechanical. The room went entirely still. "Mr. Hobbs," she said, and every syllable was its own complete statement. "You are present in this proceeding as union representation, not as counsel of record. You do not have standing to object in my courtroom. If you speak out of turn again, Bailiff Arthur will place you in a holding cell for contempt." She paused. "I am intimately and recently familiar with what that experience involves." "Are we clear?" Hobbs sat. Whatever color remained in his face departed. Bridges had just lost the only ally he'd been able to see from the witness stand. "Answer the question, Deputy Bridges," Naomi said, returning her attention to him without any indication that the interruption had cost her a single moment's composure. "Does invoking a constitutional right constitute resisting arrest?" "No, Your Honor," Bridges said, and the words came out of him like something being surrendered. "It doesn't." "No," she agreed, "it does not." She let that agreement linger in the silence of the room, and then she straightened in her chair and folded her hands on the bench in front of her. "Let me extend the hypothetical one final time. If those officers, having been refused identification by a citizen committing no observable crime, were to become enraged by that refusal, if they were to violently seize that citizen, forcibly slam her face against the trunk of her own vehicle, and apply handcuffs with deliberate malicious force sufficient to cause severe bruising and restricted circulation, would that constitute standard police procedure, or would that constitute aggravated assault under color of law and a federal deprivation of civil rights? The courtroom breathed as one entity and then stopped breathing. Naomi raised her arms and placed them flat on the surface of the mahogany bench. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her wrists upward, and the sleeves of her black robe pulled back just far enough to expose the full, dark purple bruising that wrapped both wrists completely. The marks that had been pressed into her skin by hands that were in this room right now, sitting in the front row, gripping a wooden railing until the knuckles had gone the color of old bone. Prosecutor Dana Whitmore physically pushed her chair back from the state's table, creating distance. Lance Hobbs made a sound that was not a word. A tremor ran through the gallery like something moving through water after a stone hits it, and in the middle of all of it, Deputy Colt Bridges sat on the witness stand and stared at the bruises on Naomi Caldwell's wrists. The bruises he had put there, his own signature displayed now under the unforgiving fluorescent lights of a courtroom. She ran and could not produce a single syllable. Naomi leaned forward until her voice was just above a whisper, and somehow it carried to the very last row. "I am extraordinarily familiar with your version of standard procedure, Deputy Bridges. And today we are going to take it apart together, piece by piece." The sound of Ryan Peck's chair dragging across the hardwood floor of courtroom 302 was not loud, but in the silence that had descended after Naomi's last words, it was like a crack in something structural, the sound of a thing that has been under too much pressure finally giving way. Peck was on his feet, and he was trembling in a way that had nothing performative about it. The shaking of a young man whose understanding of the consequences he is facing has just become fully catastrophically real. Tears were already tracking down his face before he had formed a single word, the involuntary tears of genuine terror that cannot be recalled once they have started. "Ryder, sit down right now," Lance Hobbs hissed from beside him, grabbing at the sleeve of his uniform with both hands, but Peck shook him off with the careless physical force of someone who has moved past the point where anything Hobbs does or says has any relevance to his situation. He looked up at the bench. He looked at Naomi Caldwell, the woman he had watched Bridges slam into the trunk of a car 12 hours ago. The woman who was now sitting 12 feet above him in a black robe with the authority of the state draped around her shoulders, and whatever calculation had been keeping him upright finished its final computation and came back with nothing. "Your Honor," Peck said, and the words came out broken and high, cracking in the middle, the way voices crack when there is no more ability to manage them. I told him in the parking lot that I wasn't sure. I asked him if he was certain. I said, "Vance, are you sure about this?" And he told me she was a nobody, and that nobody matters, and he told me to put the cuffs on her, and I... His voice broke completely. "I did it. I'm sorry. I am so sorry." The gallery erupted in the controlled way that courtroom galleries erupt. Not chaos, but the simultaneous, audible exhalation of 30 people who have just witnessed something they did not expect to witness when they sat down. Reporters who had been coasting through what was supposed to be a routine Tuesday morning hearing were now writing in fast, urgent strokes on their legal pads, their eyes not leaving the front of the room. Arthur stepped forward, his right hand dropping to his belt, reading the room for escalation that might require intervention. Naomi raised one hand, the bruised wrist fully visible, and the room went quiet. "Deputy Peck," she said, and her voice had the quality not of anger but of something more serious than anger. The voice of someone who intends to be clearly understood. "You will remain where you are, and you will not speak further without my direction." She let that settle. "As an officer of this court, I am obligated to inform you that you are currently making spontaneous voluntary admissions on the public record that constitute participation in a felony. I strongly advise you to exercise your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination immediately before you say anything else." She held his gaze for a moment. "Do you understand me?" Peck nodded his chin, dropping to his chest, and he collapsed back into his chair with the boneless surrender of someone who has run out of ways to hold himself upright. He pressed his face into his hands, and his shoulders shook with the silent, terrified grief of a man who has just thrown away everything he built in his 20s in a parking lot on a Tuesday night because he was too weak to say no to someone who told him it would be fine. The profound irony of what had just happened was not lost on anyone in the room. The woman Peck had unlawfully handcuffed 12 hours earlier was the only person in courtroom 302 who had just actively protected his constitutional rights. Prosecutor Dana Whitmore sat with that for a moment, and then she stood up, and when she spoke, her voice was the careful, precise voice of someone who is choosing every word for the permanent record. "Your Honor." Whitmore said the state cannot in good conscience proceed with the prosecution of Ray Vasquez. The entire evidentiary foundation of his arrest rests on the testimony of these two officers, and that foundation has been publicly and irreparably destroyed in this proceeding. The state hereby withdraws Deputies Bridges and Peck as credible witnesses in this or any related matter. Defense attorney Nolan Price was on his feet before Whitmore had finished her sentence. "The defense moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Vasquez with prejudice, Your Honor." The state joins the motion, Whitmore confirmed. Ray Vasquez, who had been sitting beside his attorney, in the particular coiled stillness of a person who has been waiting for 8 months for a morning that might change everything, and has almost stopped believing it will come, put his head down on the table when Naomi granted the motion and told him he was free. His shoulders shook. He didn't make a sound. He had been facing years. Naomi watched him for a moment, then turned back to her courtroom. "Bailiff Arthur," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "please secure the main doors. No one leaves." Arthur moved. The deadbolts engaged clack, clack, two sounds that echoed in the silence of the room, and that Deputy Colt Bridges recognized from somewhere very specific and very recent, and that made something in his chest collapse entirely. Naomi rose from her chair. She did not step down from the elevated bench. She stood at its full height, the black robe settling around her. And she looked out over the room, the way she had looked out over it every working morning for 11 years. With the calm, complete authority of someone who has never needed to perform it, because it was never a performance. "The power granted to law enforcement by the people of this state," she said, and her voice had the quality of something that has been sharpened to a very fine edge, and knows exactly what it is for, is not a personal possession. It is a trust. It is the authority to take a citizen's liberty, their dignity, and, in extreme cases, their life. And it is granted on the explicit understanding that it will be used to protect the public, not to satisfy the appetites of whoever is wearing the badge at the time. She raised her wrists and placed them flat on the bench one final time. The bruises fully visible, dark and clear and undeniable under the lights. Last night, Deputies Bridges and Peck used that trust as a weapon against a woman they believed had no power to fight back. They unlawfully detained her, physically assaulted her, falsified their justifications, and locked her in a holding cell, and they did it because they assumed she was powerless, and they assumed that was enough. The knock at the secured oak doors arrived at that moment, 4 deliberate measured strikes against the wood, and Naomi gave Arthur a single nod. He crossed the room through the deadbolts and pulled the doors open. Theodore Marsh came through First Chief Investigator State Attorney General's office, a compact and deliberate man in a dark suit who carried the specific energy of someone who has been waiting for this moment since before dawn and has not wasted a single minute of the waiting. 2 state troopers flanked him, their faces professionally expressionless. Behind them, Captain Doug Harlan followed in the way a man follows when he has no remaining options, which is to say without any dignity left to maintain. Marsh walked down the center aisle without acknowledging anyone he passed, pushed through the swinging gate into the well of the court, and stopped at the base of the witness stand. He looked at Bridges with the particular contempt reserved for things that have failed the precise purpose they were built for. Deputy Colt Bridges Marsh said loud enough for the back row, "You are hereby relieved of your duties, effective immediately pending criminal investigation by the State Attorney General's office and federal authorities for violations, including deprivation of rights under color of law, false arrest, falsification of official records, and aggravated assault." He turned his head slightly. "The same applies to Deputy Ryan Peck," Bridges said. "Please," in a voice that had nothing of the parking lot left in it. It was the voice of someone younger, someone frightened, someone trying to invoke a personal connection with a man who was no longer available to be invoked. He mentioned his family. He used the word misunderstanding. Marsh did not pause, did not soften, did not give him anything to hold on to. The badge came off Bridges' chest with a sharp metallic snap that was very loud in the room, and that nobody forgot afterward. Then the weapon unholstered and placed on the defense table with a hard clatter. The taser, the handcuffs, the radio. Each item surrendered separately, each one hitting the table with its own sound until Bridges stood stripped of every item that had made him feel like something more than what he was, and what he was turned out to be, a frightened man, in a uniform that no longer meant anything, in a room where the woman he had assaulted was standing 12 feet above him with the authority of the state around her like a robe. Peck surrendered the same wordlessly mechanically. The tears dried now into something worse than tears. The flat emptiness of someone who has run the numbers and found them impossible. Arthur and the troopers walked them to the doors. Bridges looked back once, his eyes going to the bench to Naomi, and she looked back at him with an expression that was not triumphant and not merciful, and was not performing either of those things for anyone watching. It was simply the face of someone who has finished necessary work. The gavel. One word. Recess. The federal investigation moved at a speed that surprised people who were accustomed to watching institutional accountability arrive slowly if it arrived at all. And the reason it moved quickly was simple. There was nothing to argue about. The dash cam footage from Bridges' cruiser, which the night shift sergeant had logged as a technical malfunction, was recovered by federal forensic technicians within 48 hours and was completely unambiguously clear. Naomi Caldwell standing at the pump, still and cooperative, and then Bridges taking hold of her arm, and then the trunk of the car, and then the handcuffs, and none of it resembling in any way the report he had filed. Ryan Peck broke during his first interrogation with the completeness of someone who has been holding something too heavy for too long and has simply run out of strength. He accepted a plea agreement, permanent resignation from law enforcement forfeiture of his pension, 2 years of federal probation with strict reporting conditions and full testimony against Bridges in exchange for avoiding prison time. He would never wear a badge again. What he offered in exchange was not just the events of the Texaco station, it was a detailed account supported by dates and locations and names of at least 9 prior incidents in which Bridges had stopped detained and in several cases physically handled Black and Latino drivers on the late Route 9 corridor, under pretexts that ranged from thin to fabricated entirely incidents that had been flagged internally by a dispatcher named Cora Shields, who had kept her own records and had been waiting for someone to ask. Lieutenant Craig Sully, the supervisor who had reviewed and signed off on Bridges' performance evaluations for 7 consecutive years and had internally resolved 23 complaints against him without escalating a single one, was removed from his supervisory position within a week and placed under formal investigation. The audit of those 23 cases took 4 months and produced findings that were not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention to the right things and very surprising to everyone who had not. Sheriff Boyd Kettrick, under whose administrative umbrella Bridges had operated and thrived for 14 years, did not face criminal charges. The line between deliberate protection and institutional negligence proved difficult to prosecute with the available evidence. But the State Oversight Board opened a formal review of the department's accountability structures that generated 31 specific recommendations, and Kettrick announced 6 weeks later that he would not be seeking re-election citing health reasons in a statement that nobody in Oak Haven County entirely believed. Lance Hobbs, the union representative, whose attempt to object from the gallery had been met with the specific reply about holding cells that had subsequently circulated on social media with a velocity that his communications team was not prepared for, was quietly removed from the negotiating committee by the union's executive board, who issued a public statement noting that his conduct did not reflect the organization's values. Nobody asked Hobbs for his perspective on that characterization. The federal trial of Colt Bridges took place 4 months later in a federal courthouse 40 miles from Oak Haven, and Bridges sat at the defense table in a gray suit that fit him poorly and carried none of the authority the uniform had lent him. And the arrogance was so completely gone that some of the reporters who had covered the courtroom scene struggled to reconcile the man they were looking at with the man they remembered. His defense attorney argued split-second judgment under pressure, the inherent difficulty of street-level policing qualified immunity, and the absence of malicious intent arguments that federal judge Patricia Osei, a woman with a documented and consistent intolerance for law enforcement corruption, that had made her a controversial judicial appointment and a highly effective one listened to with the focused attention of someone who has heard them before and knows exactly what weight to give them. Naomi testified in a Navy suit with no robe and no title invoked as protection, just herself and the facts arranged in sequence without embellishment and without audible emotion, every word chosen for the clarity of the record she was building. And by the time she stepped down from the stand, there was nothing left for the jury to argue about. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, Bridges put his face in his hands, and at sentencing, Judge Osei told him that the fact that his victim had turned out to be a judge was not the point. It never should have happened to anyone. And the reason it had happened to so many others before her was precisely because those others had not been judges, and he had counted on that, and that counting had been the real crime, the one underneath all the others. He went to a medium-security federal facility, his law enforcement background making minimum security inadvisable, and Ray Vasquez walked out of the courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon and stood in the sunlight for a long moment before getting into his mother's car, and she didn't say anything, and neither did he, because sometimes there aren't words sufficient for the specific thing that has just happened to you. Nobody announced it, and nobody signed it. But 3 weeks after the trial, a laminated card appeared on the wall of holding cell 3 at the Oak Haven County Precinct. Plain, white plain black type, listing in clear and simple language the constitutional rights of every person brought through that door, the right to remain silent, the right to refuse an unlawful search, the right to be told the charges against you. The precinct's new overnight commander, a woman named Rosario Vega, who had transferred in from the county's eastern district, read it on her first walk-through of the building and stopped in front of it for a moment, and then she kept it there, and she told the officers under her supervision to read it too, not because they didn't know what it said, but because knowing something and remembering why it matters are two different things, and the difference between them is everything. Maya Okafor, the young detention officer who had dropped the keys outside cell 3 that morning, filed her first formal complaint the following week. 1-page plain language, no legal terminology against the booking sergeant who had processed a woman through intake without opening her wallet. It was not a dramatic act. She filed it the way you do something that you have decided is simply the right thing, and that you are done finding reasons to delay. It was the first of 11 complaints she would file over the next 4 years, each one specific, each one documented, each one part of the body of evidence that the department's Civilian Review Board eventually cited when it restructured its intake procedures. Her name appeared nowhere in the final report. The credit line read only based on complaints filed by junior personnel who chose not to remain silent. Naomi Caldwell never spoke publicly about the cell or the cold or what it felt like to be on the other side of the door. Not in the reform hearings, not in the interviews, not in the speech she gave when the oversight board was formally established. She talked about policy, about structure, about the accountability mechanisms that had failed and the ones that needed to be built, and she was precise and effective, and she changed things. But in the mornings before the robe, she would stand at the bathroom mirror and push back her sleeves and look at her wrists in the light, smooth now, unmarked, the bruises long gone, and she would hold them there for just a moment, the way you hold something you are grateful not to have lost before pulling the sleeves down and going to do the work that was waiting for her. If this story moved you, if it made you think about who gets protected and who gets believed and what justice actually looks like when it finally shows up, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one, because the truth is always worth telling.